Today we will hear from Elisabeth King and Cyrus Samii on their book, Diversity, Violence, and Recognition, How Recognizing Ethnic Identity Promotes Peace. Our moderator today will be Séverine Autesserre, and before we begin, I'd like to tell you a little bit about her. Séverine Autesserre is an award-winning author, peace builder, and researcher, as well as a professor of political science at Barnard College, Columbia University, and a member of our institute. She is the author of The Trouble with the Congo, Peaceland, and the forthcoming The Front Lines of Peace. And her articles have appeared in publications such as Foreign Affairs, International Organization, and the New York Times. Séverine has been involved intimately in the world of international aid for more than 20 years. She's conducted research in 12 different conflict zones, from Colombia to Somalia to Israel and the Palestinian territories. Séverine has worked for Doctors Without Borders in places like Afghanistan and Congo, and at the United Nations headquarters in the US. Her research has helped shape the intervention strategies of several United Nations departments, foreign affairs ministries, and NGOs, as well as numerous philanthropists and activists. She's also been a featured speaker at the World Summit of Nobel Peace Laureates and at the US House of Representatives. Thank you again, Séverine, for bringing Elisabeth and Cyrus back to Columbia, and thank you to the Institute for African Studies for their co-sponsorship. And now I'll hand things over to you.
Thank you so much, Ingrid. Thanks for this very kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for joining us today for this event. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome Professor Elisabeth King and Professor Cyrus Samii to talk about their new book, Diversity, Violence, and Recognition. And as Ingrid was already implying, it's a particularly meaningful book for us here at the Saltzman Institute, not only, of course, because the book's topic fits exactly the kind of things that we all study and research, but also because, in a way, the book was actually born here, years and years ago, when Elisabeth and Cyrus were respectively a postdoc and an advanced PhD student at Columbia. Elisabeth is now an associate professor of international education and politics at New York University. She's the founding director of NYU's minor in peace and conflict studies. And her first book, From Classroom to Conflicts in Rwanda, is a classic for people who work on the intersection of education, war, and peace. It was named an outstanding title by the American Libraries Association, and it was also a choice outstanding title. Elisabeth has published in numerous journals, and she's won absolutely huge research grants, I think larger than any political scientist that I know. If I remember correctly, the last one was $500,000 or $1 million, something absolutely huge. Anyway, very successful scholar. And as for Cyrus, he's also joining us from NYU, where he's an associate professor of politics, and he's the executive director of the Evidence in Governance and Politics Network. Cyrus has published in top peer-reviewed journals in our field, like American Political Science Review, American Journal of Political Science, etc. And I'm sure many of you remember him from his time here when he was a PhD student at Columbia. And today we're really privileged to have both of them spend an hour with us to talk about their new book, which I'm going to show you again, Diversity, Violence, and Recognition. It's an absolutely fabulous book with enormous policy and scholarly implications. And so rather than telling you all myself about the book and about why I like it so much, I'm going to let Elisabeth and Cyrus speak about it. So Elisabeth and Cyrus are going to give us a very brief overview of the book for about 10 minutes. Then I'm going to ask them a few questions. I'll interview them for about 20 minutes so that they can give you a sense of the book's arguments and the implication of the book. And then we're going to open the floor to Q&As for another half hour or so. So we're going to take a few live questions. And then at 10 to 1 or 5 to 1, I'm going to ask all of the people who still have questions to send them through the chat so that Elisabeth and Cyrus can answer them together before we end the event, and we're going to try to end the event around 1 p.m. So Elisabeth, Cyrus, please go ahead.
Thank you so much to the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies and the Institute of African Studies, and especially, of course, to Séverine Autesserre and Ingrid Gersman, and to all of you for being here. We see both old friends and new names on our call today. Cyrus and I are delighted to be here and really excited to be talking about our new book. Now, the book is rooted in our experiences, for me, in Rwanda, and Burundi, right next door for Cyrus. So these two countries in Central Africa, they both have similarly violent pasts. They have nearly identical ethnic and material structural conditions. And as you can see, if we flip to the next slide, the two have chosen diametrically opposed strategies to deal with ethnicity in the aftermath of violence. Burundi has embraced what we call recognition, with quotas for ethnic groups in public institutions. Rwanda, in contrast, tries to, per its constitution, eradicate ethnic identity. And ethnicity can only be talked about in a very few specific state-sanctioned ways. So given what some scholars call an enduring debate in the conflict management literature, we wanted to know how often post-conflict countries choose recognition or non-recognition, the conditions under which recognition is chosen, and of course, which works better for peace. So Cyrus will tell you a little bit about what we did in order to answer these questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Elisabeth. Thank you very much, Séverine and Ingrid. And it's great to be back on the 13th floor, as it were, at IAB, at least virtually. So continuing on from where Elisabeth left off, the first thing that we set out to do in this project was to map the extent to which quotas, autonomy arrangements, and other what we call recognition strategies have been adopted to manage conflicts around the world. And I should say that this was an undertaking that began about 10 years ago. It was a very exhaustive effort, but we think it produced some very interesting results. What we have here is a map that displays the results. So first, let me clarify conceptually, by recognition, what we mean, at least for this coding, is the explicit and formal use of ethnic identities as a way to acknowledge diversity or define group-based rights like quotas in formal political institutions. And so what we found on that basis, if we looked at constitutions or comprehensive political settlements that were adopted in the context of violent conflicts, we found that recognition was adopted in 40% of these post-conflict constitutions or political settlements during the period 1990 to 2012. So that was sort of the period that we were looking at in terms of coding the adoption of recognition. Our analysis of the effects extends into the more recent past. So what you see here is a map on top, and on the slide, the cases in dark gray represent the cases in which recognition was ultimately adopted, during this time period, or at least by the end point of the time period that we're looking at. And then the light gray cases are cases of non-recognition. The white cases were ones that aren't included in the study because they didn't meet the criteria that we're using to define a conflict-affected context. And so what we see is that there is a lot of variation to be explained. We looked at many factors to try to understand why some countries were adopting recognition and others were not. This includes international factors like colonial inheritances or various types of international engagement. It also includes domestic factors like levels of democracy or whether wars ended with military victory or negotiated settlements. And the factor that stood out strongest in this analysis was a domestic factor, and in particular, whether a country was under minority ethnic rule or not. And that's what the table below is showing. It's just showing the basic pattern for 86 what we call constitutional moments. So these are basically instances in which either a constitution or a comprehensive political settlement was adopted. So we had 86 of them in this time period that we were looking at There are, by the way, cases where countries appear more than once. So for example, Burundi, there were constitutional moments just prior to the onset of the civil war, then sort of during the first peace process that culminated in 2000, and then once again with the adoption of a constitution that clearly marked the end of the civil war in 2005. So some countries appear more than once. And what we found was that countries that were under minority ethnic rule at the time of this constitutional moment adopted recognition less than a quarter of a time. So that's the 24% that you see down there in the lower right corner. By contrast, when a leader, basically the person who occupied sort of like the pivotal leadership position, so head of state type position, was from the largest ethnic group, recognition was adopted 60% of the time. So that was a very dramatic difference across these two ethnic power configurations. Okay, so that was a key finding that we have, and a little bit later we'll talk a little bit about how we interpret that difference. Then looking at the effects of recognition, what we find is that on average, countries adopting recognition experience less violence, more economic vitality, and more inclusive politics. And these graphs give you an indication of the type of data that we're looking at. These are just the raw trend lines for the probability of violence taking place. So this is large-scale violence as coded by the UCDP data set. Or on the right-hand side, we have trend lines for a measure of the quality of democracy from the VDEM project. So it's a polyarchy index. The solid lines are for the cases that would ultimately adopt recognition. The dashed lines are for those that wouldn't. And then that vertical solid line shows you the point in time at which this sort of crucial decision was made. So that gives you the time of the constitutional agreement. And so what you see is that even though these countries were starting off at relatively similar places at the time of adoption, and even the trends, resemble each other. In the analysis in the book, we do more to sort of account for any differences in those pre-trends. We see a separation that occurs in the post-constitution or post-settlement period, with those countries that adopt recognition experiencing less violence. So you can see that sort of settling in by about year 4, and higher levels of democracy as measured by this index. What we found in studying this further is that these beneficial effects of recognition are actually driven by a particular subset of cases in the data. And they are cases in which ethnicity is highly salient. So these are basically places that from the EPR data set, they were coded as ethnic civil wars, and cases where plurality group leaders rather than minority leaders were in charge. Our interpretation is that, our interpretation of all of this is based on a theory that discusses what we call, on the one hand, the assuring effects of recognition, and then on the other hand, the mobilization effects of recognition. And in the book, what we do is to develop this theory and explain how minority leaders face a dilemma of recognition that plurality or majority group leaders don't face, and that this may make minority group leaders hesitant to choose recognition and also less likely to reap its benefits. Then the next part of the book digs deeper into dynamics that are on the ground. We carried out case studies of Burundi, Rwanda, and Ethiopia, and I'll turn it back to Elisabeth to discuss those.
Yeah, thanks, Cyrus. So the case studies were certainly fascinating, and they suggested to us that recognition and non-recognition work in paradoxical ways. So we learned from Burundi, I believe Cyrus took the photo at left, that the extensive use of ethnic quotas has led to ethnic cleavages becoming increasingly less relevant politically. Whereas I took the photo on the right at a Gacaca meeting in Rwanda, we learned from Rwanda that despite far-reaching restrictions on ethnicity in politics and in discourse, deep inter-ethnic mistrust persists. Now, we also investigated the case of Ethiopia, which was especially interesting since this was a minority regime that adopted recognition. And what we saw there was that ethnic identity certainly remains salient, but it's also hard to imagine that the ethnic factions would have worked together to overthrow the Ancien Regime without recognition. So taking a step back, and by way of wrapping up our introductory remarks, we started this book not knowing what kind of story we'd be telling. We investigated, people have hinted at how long it took us to do that. The facts, though, spoke rather clearly, and the book turns out to be an optimistic account of the promise of ethnic recognition. So we really look forward to continuing the conversation. Thanks so much.
Séverine is still muted.
That's so awkward and embarrassing. Thank you, Cyrus. Okay, so thanks, Cyrus, and thanks, Elisabeth. That was super interesting, and that was a fantastic summary of this book. And I want to go back to some of the things that that both of you told us, and I'm going to start with maybe Elisabeth, if you don't mind. Can you tell us about how this project became a book? I mentioned a connection to Columbia University when I introduced both of you. Am I right in remembering that there is such a connection?
Well, thanks very much for the question, Séverine. So I was a postdoc at Columbia finishing a study of Rwanda, which is this country that went from recognition before the genocide to non-recognition in the post-genocide period. And Cyrus was, of course, finishing his PhD there with a study of Burundi, which was a case that went from non-recognition before mass violence along ethnic lines to recognition. And so it began in casual conversations in the building we'd all be in, were it not for the pandemic. And we began wondering about the effectiveness, of ethnic quotas. And then the project kept getting bigger because we realized before we could ask this question about effectiveness, we had to go back to the origins and ask questions about how ethnic recognition, ethnic quotas came about, because we didn't want to mix up those things analytically. And we realized quickly it wasn't just ethnic quotas, but we had the opportunity to think about a wider set of policy options and see if they might follow a similar strategic logic and answer a higher order question really about conflict management strategies in diverse contexts. And of course, there's so many people for us to thank at Columbia, including you. We're thinking Jack Snyder, Sarah Zuckerman-Daly, Kamuli Kasara. So many people read this book, and we're really grateful to so many of them.
Thank you, Elisabeth. And I think I'm speaking for all of us who read the book when I say that one of the central concepts that stick in our minds when we read the book is the term of ethnic recognition. And you've mentioned it already several times during your presentation. So can one of us tell us more about it? So what it means, how you use it, how you measure it?
Yeah, so happy to take this on. So, I mean, this is the concept that the book is trying to advance. And, you know, it's a high level concept that we're trying to use to organize the analysis in terms of what we think is a very crucial choice and that we think actually identifies like a key axis in many scholarly debates. Many of the scholarly debates, you know, are sort of philosophical, and you know, they speak to sort of like I guess the logical coherence of systems that are predicated on ideas of recognition as opposed to non-recognition. For us, we wanted to view this more in terms of institutional design and in terms of like what happens on the ground and in terms of actual history, you know, what's transpired on the basis of the choice to work on the basis of this concept as opposed to a non-recognition concept. And so in that way, you know, we take the analysis to a kind of higher level of aggregation, like Elisabeth had said, rather than thinking about like the details of ethnic federalism or, you know, one type of quotas versus another type of quotas. We thought that there was actually like a sort of crucial overarching principle that was being debated prior to any of those technical details, and that's where our analysis focuses. I should say as well that the concept is meant to capture situations in which people are like affirmatively acknowledging the diversity of identities that make up the body politic, and that those identities are kind of packed with meaning in terms of history. And so this is different. We wanted to distinguish this from like the ways of sort of like designating groups for the purposes of like apartheid, for example. There's what we mean by recognition in terms of like the positive affirmation of this diversity and acknowledgement of those histories, and the kind of like inequalities that may need to be addressed on the basis of that is very much what we have in mind with recognition. And so we don't want people to sort of confuse what we're proposing or what we're saying to mean that we're advocating apartheid type systems or anything like that. We think there's something fundamentally different that's there.
Right, and that's why the cases of Rwanda and Burundi are such good illustrations for your argument. And Elisabeth, you've told us a little bit about Burundi and Rwanda during your opening remarks, but I also remember in the book that you talk a lot about Ethiopia, and basically the book is about it has three in-depth case studies: Rwanda, Burundi, Ethiopia. And so can you tell us more about why, you have this high-level concept that Cyrus told us about, and so why did you decide to have these three specific case studies in the book?
Yeah, thank you for asking, Séverine. So when Cyrus was alluding to these 86 constitutional moments that we studied, these come from 57 countries. So the book does cover a global landscape. But then, of course, cross-national analysis, while it illuminated some really important trends, also had its limitations. And we thought that we could begin to address some of those limitations by taking a more in-depth investigation into some of the cases that modeled some of the patterns in which we were most interested in. So of course we have our own experiences in Rwanda and Burundi, but also there's fascinating variation within these cases and this controlled set of comparisons, the cases against each other. And then I mentioned that Ethiopia was a minority regime until quite recently, until 2018. And we also have variation over time there. So going from a non-recognition regime to a recognition regime, and allowing us to investigate what happens when a minority adopts recognition. And then in these choices too, we were trying to limit some of the competing explanations to allow us to concentrate on the validity of our interpretation. So for instance, Cyrus in the opening remarks alluded to that we investigated colonial history. But of course, Rwanda and Burundi have the same colonial history. So that's not explaining the variation that we see in those contexts or over time, and Ethiopia wasn't colonized. Or we look at this norm of post-independence non-recognition in Africa. And of course, we see variation in these countries again. So that's limited. There's authoritarian leaders in these contexts that have chosen both recognition and non-recognition. We have military victory in Rwanda and Ethiopia that chose different pathways. So there was a lot that these cases allowed us to do, and we certainly learned a ton from them.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I was interested in. I'm always interested in when I see finished products like that. You've mentioned that you learned a lot from these cases. You also mentioned, I think at the end of the presentation, you said, well, we didn't know what we would find when we started the research. And so I know that both of you have worked on this book for years. I've certainly heard about it for a very long time. And one of the things that personally I love about doing this kind of year-long, in-depth, long-term research for a book is that I discover a lot of things that I would never have thought about before. And so I'm sure that both of you experienced that when you were working on diversity, violence, and recognition. So what was the most surprising aspect of your research? What surprised you in what you discovered in this research?
Let me respond to that if I may, because I think that Elisabeth pointed to it when discussing the case studies. We discovered these paradoxes that for us present a very interesting avenue for future research and where things should go. The paradoxes were that on the one hand, in Burundi, for example, the adoption of recognition paradoxically seems to have had the consequence of depoliticizing ethnicity insofar as recent crises that have taken place there, for example, since 2015, most notably, right, have presented a series of power vacuums and challenges to political authority and consolidation in that country. If we were, blind to everything that had happened since the early 90s in that country, I think the expectation would be that the usual patterns would have emerged, right? This cycle of violence across the Hutu-Tutsi axis, identity axis in the country would have come to overwhelm and dominate discourse and political mobilization in the country. Now, what we've seen since 2015, obviously, is not the complete absence of that. It's certainly featured into the dynamic, but I think by any reasonable account, it's not the dominant dynamic that's at work in the country. And to me, that is a strong testament to the fact that these institutional interventions have contributed to transforming politics and, in a way, depoliticizing or at least reducing the salience of ethnicity in that country. And that actually runs very contrary to the inherited wisdom of the primary risk of recognition, was that you would basically be somehow entrenching ethnicity as a primary reference for politics. But I think the point is that there are ways that you can recognize this diversity of experience and the need to redress inequalities that are associated with that explicitly, and then also to design institutions that in a way that would seem paradoxical on the basis of the inherited wisdom to actually depoliticize ethnicity. And I think there's indication of that. And the very opposite, we think, is at work in Rwanda insofar as, efforts to force people to avoid reference basically thrusts a lot into the private sphere, into the realm of rumor and, sort of hidden transcripts that circulate, right? And by not bringing it into the open, it has the potential for the salience of ethnicity to be sustained through that activity and lead to the potential for a lot of volatility very much along those lines in the future. It doesn't resolve the mistrust. And so I think the biggest surprise that we had was like that those paradoxes came out and seemed to challenge the inherited wisdom from past literature.
It does, and it also reminds me of one of the things that I absolutely love about the book is that the policy implications that you have are absolutely crucially important. And I know that in the audience today, we have quite a few people who are not academics, but rather practitioners and policymakers. So if you were to offer advice to someone who's, let's say, working on a constitutional process or working on a peace process, what would you say?
Yeah. Thank you. Of course, we'd say it with humility. I think there are some things that we can take from this book to suggest, and maybe the first one would be that recognition is a choice. And so in the book, we describe, for instance, the case of Kenya, where leaders came together in the aftermath of the 2007-2008 violence that was often targeted along ethnic lines, and both options were really debated. So we see some that said they needed a constitution that named and recognized what one prominent Kenyan author called the tribal nations within our nation. And then we had others who wanted to really do away with ethnicity in politics. And I remember we had a conversation with Yash Gai, for instance, who was part of that constitutional commission. So all that to say, like, there is this choice, and countries are not alone in making that choice. So there is a plethora of historical cases to consult. And the book actually might help you figure out, which cases to consult, because we think this ethnic power configuration is really important. So if you have a leader from a plurality group versus a leader from a minority group, the book helps you understand how their positionality and strategic choices might be different, and that there might be different examples to look at in that history. The book does some other things too. We talk, and we haven't mentioned, about all these different domains that we talk about. So we've talked at the high level about recognizing or not recognizing in constitutions and political settlements, but we also examine implementation across 7 domains. So the executive, the legislative, the security sector, civil service, this is testing me, judicial, education, language. And so what we also showed that there's a lot of possibility of different sectors to engage with in terms of recognition. And of course, I think too, just to take away that institutional engineering is hard. These paradoxical effects that we're talking about, and it's a challenging context. There's certainly something to learn from the recent historical record.
Yeah, thanks, Elisabeth. And that's something to learn for people who work on constitutional processes in places that have experienced conflict or that are still experiencing conflict. But I have one last question before I open the floor to Q&As from the audience. So the book focuses on these intense violence conflict, mostly outside of North America and Europe. But I also remember saying in the book that there are lessons that we can apply to what's going on closer to us. So for example, in the United States. So can one of you tell us very briefly about that?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. I think I can tie this into a discussion that I had been having very recently, including some Twitter threads and things like that, that actually tie some of the issues that we talk about in the book to some of the issues that have been raised by the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States. I think there are connections here to the issue of descriptive representation, affirmative action, all those debates, and the extent to which those might serve as like strategies to address some of the structural inequalities that we have in a society like the United States. And I think that like what we have in this book is a record from places of very intense conflict that suggests some promise from these innovations. I think one thing I want to highlight, by the way, is that a big part of the book is to kind of acknowledge the institutional experimentation that's been undertaken by leaders from around the world. So in particular, in the 3 countries that we look at in the case studies, we really think that the leaders who were involved, domestic leaders who were involved in negotiating those constitutions and settlements were really, you know, they're all experimenting with institutional forms. And those are things that we should all be learning from as people that are sort of like advocating for strategies and just as scientists trying to understand. And I think what we come away with is like a sort of promising argument and set of findings with respect to recognition-based strategies. And I think things like descriptive representation and affirmative action are variants of that. And so the question is like, you know, can we carry that through into other contexts? I think there's been like a decent amount of empirical work and theoretical work that explicates how the use of descriptive representation tools and affirmative action tools can help to shift axes of political competition and address grievances. There's plenty of work that I'd be happy to follow up on with others pointing to that. These are obviously subject to longstanding debate in countries like the United States, but I think that there's reason to entertain them. It's kind of interesting, I think, that with like Black Lives Matter in the United States, I've found that the attention to those types of interventions is a little bit less in favor, viewing those as more like reform type activities as opposed to the more radical types of restructuring that's been proposed. But I feel like discounting those sorts of strategies may be due to reasons that aren't necessarily attentive to their potential effectiveness. And so there's been some work by Anna Harvey in my department, for example, who's looked at, you know, the promise of using recognition-based strategies like descriptive representation and trying to diversify officer corps, for example, in police around cities to help address problems of violence against Black populations by police. And so I think there are lessons, and I think the idea of like developing strategies on the principle of recognition is something that travels much further than the context in which we're looking and have direct relevance to some of the issues that we're facing here in the United States as well as other countries in the global north.
Thank you so much, Cyrus. And so now we're going to open the floor to questions from the audience. I'm sure people have a lot of questions for you. Ray already said that he had a question. And then everybody else, if you want to raise your hand, I'm going to call on you as I see the blue hand raised. Ray, do you want to go ahead?
Hi, thank you. Thank you all for coming today. This is a very, very urgent topic. But I'm also relaying these questions from James. He's having some issues with audio over there. So basically, China and Russia have numerous recognized minorities in their autonomous regions. Thinking of the recent unrest in Inner Mongolia and the prior unrest in Xinjiang and Tibet, and of the concerns around separatism in such regions, how do you see ethnic recognition from the state addressing such issues? I ask because but China is pursuing a policy of second-generation assimilation via language education in the schools. And if you have time, also, is there a difference between in ethnic peace outcomes between autocratic states and emerging democracies? Thank you.
Cyrus, do you want to start with a more general question, and I might speak to the education dimension?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that, like, so, I have to profess that I, am not like steeped in those particular cases to be able to comment on the details, but I guess I can just say, I can just sort of discuss some of the arguments that come out of the book, and it would be interesting to know whether or not they seem to work in these particular cases. I mean, I think what we would be proposing would be that those types of assimilation policies may have the paradoxical effect of sustaining the salience of ethnicity insofar as they're basically barring people from expressing whatever grievances that they might have that sort of correspond to being, seen as having been disadvantaged on the basis of one's group identity. And so one can appreciate like the objective of trying to move toward, a state in which people somehow forget about ethnic identities and move on to some sort of ideal, like ethnic identity free ideal. But one finding that we had from our case studies is that attempts to pursue that may actually generate the opposite effect. And so there's a question that comes prior, in our view, as to whether or not those policies are undertaken with an appreciation of, sort of any inequalities, whether political, economic, social, that are still relevant, whether that history is being addressed. If non-recognition is coupled with basically failure to acknowledge that, then those are the conditions in which we think that paradoxical effect of non-recognition are most likely to be found. It's an open question, I think, and some people discuss the strategy that the Kagame regime in Rwanda has been pursuing in terms of trying to, on the one hand, address the inequalities by generating, a tremendous amount of economic growth really, really quickly, trying to lift all boats while simultaneously pursuing a superordinate, national identity. The combination of those two things, could have different effects potentially in the long run. History, will determine, but I think it's still a bit too early to judge. But happy to turn it over to Elisabeth to speak to more of the specifics.
Yeah, no, thanks. I don't know. Unfortunately, I can't do the specifics either, because you're right. This set of cases in particular is outside, of the 57 that we explored in this book. But speaking just to education and language, which you brought up in particular, Ray. So I did mention that we looked across these 7 domains. And so to look at, in what domains was recognition more likely to occur. And so recognition was least likely to occur in sectors like the executive or the security sector, and most common in education and language. And I think that's something worth noting and exploring further. We wonder, maybe something like the executive and the security sector is more direct, quicker, faster redistribution of power in these really high stakes domains. And we wonder about education and language being seen as something that might be a longer run, less politically thorny at that moment, but trickier in the longer run, of course. So I did really appreciate that education language dimension of your question. And then the last part was about autocracies and democracies in terms of adopting recognition. And we used the Freedom House rating to look at our cases as being free, partly free, or not free. So a minority of cases were described as free. These are the European cases. And here, being free was perfectly predictive of recognition. So 100% of those cases recognized. That said, the vast majority of the cases are partly free or not free. And across those two categorizations, we saw equal rates of recognition and non-recognition.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elisabeth and Cyrus. And we have a question from Yang.
Hi, thank you so much for the excellent presentation of your fascinating research. I'm Yang, a visiting scholar at Saltzman Institute. Because I believe this research has so much implication for many countries, including China, I just addressed. May I ask you both, tell us more about the causal mechanism, how this is ethnic recognition lead to the less violent and more democratic societies, because I think we need to know this to persuade those countries who are experiencing these problems. Thank you.
Sure, happy to talk about that a little bit more. So the book develops the theory in much more detail, just to give you a sort of like sketch of the argument. So basically the idea is that, like, you know, recognition, insofar as it in the first instance acknowledges the diversity of experiences and inequalities that exist on the basis of identity, you know, provides a foundation for basically offering redress for those inequalities. And so, I mean, in this, we're strongly influenced by the work of Francis Stewart and Lars-Erik Sederman and colleagues, in sort of pointing to horizontal inequality as being a fundamental driver of conflict in the modern era. And so we see recognition strategies as being ways of just directly addressing those in ways that free elections, markets, and other quote unquote liberal institutions are incapable of doing. There's ample evidence and good theoretical work to talk about how those sort of strategies that attempt to avoid ethnicity but rather extend rights in a uniform manner actually have the potential to reproduce inequalities, and so therefore can oftentimes exacerbate inequality, and so therefore don't necessarily serve as a way of addressing the horizontal inequalities. By actually using recognition to sort of note these things explicitly in the first instance, we think provides, just at a symbolic level, some psychological relief that, you know, one's you know, grievances are being recognized, but then it also serves as basically a foundation for designing institutions for targeting these inequalities directly. The other thing it allows members in recognition regimes, societies to do is to get a good sense of the extent to which they're actually making progress. So under a recognition regime, you know, countries are basically given the ability to collect data and provide like a transparent record of progress that's being made to address horizontal inequalities. So in countries that pursue non-recognition very aggressively, so France is like the canonical model, you know, you don't have the circulation of statistics, for example, that allow people to really assess whether any progress is being made. And this is what we mean by you're basically pushing these issues into the realm of rumor and mistrust. And so, you know, it's difficult if people can't really see clearly whether or not their issues are being addressed, whether horizontal inequalities are being addressed, for that mistrust to be overcome. So all of those things are what we put on the side of the so-called assuring effects of recognition. Then we also have the effect whereby you're basically granting license in a society for people to reference ethnic identity in, among other things, political mobilization. In a place where you basically have a majority group who occupy key, like basically majority ethnic group members occupy key positions of power, then this doesn't present any particular challenge to them. It actually maybe helps them insofar as people, you know, sort of act politically on the basis of their identity to maintain their political standing. So in countries under plurality ethnic rule, such as China, we don't see there being a real trade-off here. You get the assuring effects, and there's no sort of threat that arises to political stability necessarily. In places where you have minority ethnic rule, then, you know, insofar as people are granted license to reference ethnic identity in political discourse, then they also have the opportunity to say, hey, you know, look at that minority group guy who's in charge. You know, that person doesn't deserve to be in charge. Insofar as those sorts of appeals actually find following, then you have you can recognition has the potential to create political problems and undermine stability. And so there we can understand a self-interested leader not wanting to basically license that type of discourse, and so therefore seeking to avoid it. But in a country like China, we think that the circumstances both in terms of the consequences for political mobilization, but then also the assuring effects, both align in the direction of allowing and favoring the use of recognition to address internal conflict.
Elisabeth, do you want to add something, or do you want us to move on to the next question?
I see someone else and I see the time ticking down, so why don't we go to the next question? But thank you for asking.
Thanks, Elisabeth. So, Michael.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is fascinating. My question is about the role of local reconciliation processes in recognition. The example that comes to mind is the Rwanda government's use of gacaca courts. And I'm curious if you see that as advancing or inhibiting recognition. Thanks.
Thanks for your question, Michael. So this analysis is clearly state-centric, and we put a lot in terms of strategic decision on these pivotal leaders. And we recognize that we do that, and we're transparent about it. And I think that with so much of the literature focusing on the actions of the international community, that is in itself an important corrective to shine some light on these really key domestic elites. That said, and with Séverine, of course, chairing our panel this afternoon, the importance of these more local processes comes to mind. And so you asked about the gacaca process in Rwanda in particular. So let me just say that Rwanda is a case of non-recognition, of course, right? As we've mentioned, the Constitution itself even sets to, quote, eradicate ethnic identity. But then in looking at the implementation of non-recognition, this is where it gets thornier, because while clearly non-recognition is implemented in a host of ways, there's also recognition that it was the genocide of the Tutsis, and ethnicity is talked about in very particular state-sanctioned ways that have to do with commemoration of the genocide, including in gachachas, but also including in memorials and in museums, for instance. So that's where it gets trickier, I think, to look at these two parallel processes that are going on. So a strong process of non-recognition, but then select recognition paired with victimhood and culpability. And also, in the chapter that we develop here, some real favoritism in some cases for a select group of Tutsis that had been in exile in Uganda. So all of that to say, the case studies allowed us to explore these complexities and intricacies that you can't get at by coding something in a binary recognition, non-recognition way. And of course, we think that processes that are happening at international levels and at local levels are going to be really important to complement whatever kind of decision-making is happening at the state level. And certainly implementation is going to be at all different levels. So recognition we see as this really promising tool, but not the be-all and the end-all, and with certainly needing to be paired with a bunch of other types of efforts and implementation.
I have a question.
Great.
So Ingrid, please go ahead. Omar also had a question, and everybody else, if you have any questions, please send them via the chat so that Elisabeth and Cyrus can answer them in a few minutes, and then we're going to wrap up because we're almost out of time. Ingrid, do you want to ask yours, and then I'm going to call on Omar?
Sure. For Elisabeth, if you were to offer advice to someone working on a constitutional process or a peace process, what would you tell them?
And Omar, you wanted to ask a question.
Oops, sorry. Am I unmuted? Thank you. Thank you very much. In terms of recognition and its various typologies and instances, has the detailed analysis that you guys did for Rwanda, Burundi, and Ethiopia uncovered a potential mitigating impact of the on violence and its severity, of the recognition of minorities of the minorities' rights to organize through political groups or labor unions, since it would potentially provide a potential environment for the mediation of civil contention? Thank you.
And I don't see any other questions. So Elisabeth and Cyrus, do you want to answer these two questions together before we wrap up?
Sure. I think with respect to Ingrid's question on advice, I would point to what Elisabeth had proposed. In the first instance, those who are involved in these processes, whether domestic actors or international actors who are facilitating, can appreciate that, I mean, the situation that they're entering into is not one that's like perfectly, I mean, in some ways unique in history, but bears some resemblance to other cases in history. And our book gives them some ideas as to what they might look for in terms of identifying what the analogous cases are. And we think that in particular, the ethnic power configuration is an important contextual variable to look at, and probably the most important variable to look at in terms of trying to define what cases from which you should be trying to learn. And so that's like a key takeaway. And then to also appreciate these paradoxical effects and try and understand the potential for which these paradoxical effects to take hold and what the consequences are for the case at hand. I think at a high level, I think those are some of the lessons that we have, and also not to shy away from recognition, basically. I think with respect to Omar's question, very, very interesting one. I guess in speaking for myself, like the situation that we have, like say in Burundi, the case that I know best, I mean, when we speak of like the minority regime there, I mean, well, it might be a little bit different than what we're thinking about in many other cases, right? Because this is a case where you had a legacy of minority ethnic domination for many decades, and then you had a sort of quasi-revolutionary transition of power. And so what minority recognition means in that context, I think is very different than what we mean by groups that have suffered sort of decades of exclusion or marginalization, right? That said, the assuring mechanisms that we talk about as being important for the contribution of recognition to peace, we think directly, attempt to address issues of marginalization and exclusion, and so presumably have a role to play in the way that you've been talking about. But some of the finer points about allowing for sort of minority organization and mobilization, like as opposed to things that promote integration, so minority groups to work in conjunction with majority or plurality groups, those are some finer details that we need a lot more time to get into, I would say.
Thanks, Cyrus. And maybe with the last 30 seconds, just to say one of the interesting things that we had to try to make clear in the book was that while we tend to think about minority as equivalent with marginalized, that's not always the case. And so we had to parse those distinctions. And then, maybe also in response to your question, going back to Séverine's question about what surprised us in writing the book, some people, and certainly a substantial body of literature suggests that the push for recognition worldwide comes from minorities. But what we find here is a much more complicated story, that actually the cases that have the most post-conflict recognition, at least in ethnically diverse contexts, are not those minority-led regimes, but places where pluralities are in this pivotal position. So, of course, everything Cyrus said about the assuring effects are where we, I think, get at the most of your answer about the rights to organize. But there are certainly really interesting complexities about minority and plurality status that were surprising to many and have surprised us at various stages, certainly.
Thank you so much. Elisabeth, Cyrus, thank you so much for this fascinating presentation. All of you, thank you for joining us. Again, if you want to know more about all of these topics, I highly recommend the book. It's really super interesting, and it's short for such an important book. It's actually quite short and very pleasant to read. So Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of the day, a wonderful weekend, and hopefully we'll see you all soon again on Zoom or in person in the near future. Thank you, Elisabeth.
Thank
Thank
you
you,
so
Cyrus.
much. Goodbye.